I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Where are our prophets now? Where are those messengers God chooses to communicate divine revelation through? In the past, the Creator sent prophets like Abraham, Siddhartha, Jesus, Muhammad, and many more. Maybe our higher power has switched tactics since we reinterpret God's words as soon as the Creator's prophets leave us. Could it be that Spirit talks to each one of us individually and we haven't learned to listen? On Words of the Prophets, our modern prophets show us how to find the internal prophet that is the I Am, and we discuss the application of spiritual principles in all aspects of our lives.
Love and light, everybody. I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Today, my guests are, on my far right, Rabbi Mordecai Sher of, I'm going to mess this up, Beit Midrash Kol Barama?
Beit Midrash Kol Barama.
Good, thank you. And to my immediate right is Rabbi Marvin Schwab, and I can do this one, Temple Beth Shalom. Thank you. And we're going to have fun today.
Yes,
Today's prophetic topic is a still small voice. And the topic is from the first book of the Kings, chapter 19, verses 11 to 13. And these verses read as follows. And he said, Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in an earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. And it was so, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle, and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice unto him, and said, What doest thou here, Elijah? And we're going to talk about this. And what we're going to talk about, I kind of gave a little clue last week at the end of the show, was we're going to do a two-part series on the books of the prophets. I chose these books because I think that they have a lot of significance in both Judaism and Catholicism, Christianity. And we're going to look at them today from the Jewish perspective, or perspectives. And then next week we're going to look at them from the Christian perspectives, because I think they are viewed separately and differently. And so we'll start that off with, why don't we just introduce ourselves? Rabbi Schwab, you want to just kind of...
Sure. I'm the rabbi of Temple Beth Shalom here in Santa Fe. We are affiliated with the Union for Reform Judaism, which is the reform movement of Judaism in America. I think today we're going to have the classic 2 Jews, 3 views. And it is wonderful to be here with my friend and colleague, Rabbi Mordecai Sher.
Oh boy. I'm Mordecai Sher, the rabbi of Kol Barama. We're a small, almost minuscule congregation in town, but we are representative of a traditional pursuit and manner in Judaism. We're not affiliated with any congregational bodies, but if we had to have a label, we'd definitely be called an Orthodox congregation.
Very good. Thank you both for coming.
Thank
So
you.
let's start with the whole statement we started with, that still small voice by Elijah. Elijah was, would I be fair in saying, the first prophet who didn't get his own book?
No, I don't think there's a book of Samuel either, is there?
Yeah, sure there is.
Not just Kings?
No, you've got, I mean, if you go in order of the Tanakh, in order of a traditional biblical text, so after the 5 books of Moses, after the Torah, you've got Joshua, you've got Shoftim, Judges, which was written by Samuel, and then you have the book of Samuel, and then you get to...
What about Nathan? Does he count?
Natan HaNavi does not have his own book, that's true. And he would, this actually already touches on an interesting thing, you see. When we speak traditionally about the prophets in the Bible, as distinct from prophets in general, if we speak just about the prophets in the Bible, so our tradition says there are 48 prophets, meaning we can go through the biblical text and we can single out 48 people who our tradition identifies as significant prophets in the Bible. So Eliyahu is actually a little later because, as you just mentioned, Nathan, who was the prophet who mentored and also rebuked King David, right? So he's an earlier figure, and he's definitely one of the 48. So
what distinguishes the 48 from, we have, they call it the latter prophets, which I'm assuming are the last set of prophets that were...
No, they'd all be included. I think we have a little bit of a different division in our, I'll say, original organizing of the Tanakh, of the Bible, as opposed to the later Christian redaction. Our tradition says, the sages in the Talmud say that in fact there were thousands upon thousands of prophets in Israel. Prophecy was a characteristic thing of the spiritual life of Israel. So what distinguishes the 48 prophets, or at least the prophets who have their own books, is that they had something to say which was l'sha'atam u'la'atid lavo, that what they had to say and what they were experiencing and communicating was both for their own time and for future generations. But beyond that, we have a whole notion of a culture of prophecy which is beyond the Bible.
Let's define prophet.
Well, wait, hold on.
Go ahead.
Because there were apparently guilds of prophets, unions. And prophecy may have actually been hereditary. So you have the comment from one of the prophets, I am neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet.
It's interesting. I never heard that theory before.
So
It's new to me.
And there was an association of music with prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
So Miriam, Moses' sister, is called a prophet or prophetess, if you want to use the feminine form, I guess. And the one time that happens is when the Red Sea parts, Sea of Reeds rather, the Jews get through, the sea closes up on the Egyptian army, and she leads the children of Israel in song and dance, celebrating not the death of their enemy, but their survival. But at that moment, when she picks up her timbrel and leads the women in song and dance, that's the one place where she's referred to as a prophet.
So prophet, if I'm hearing you
Jethro
correctly,
No, he invented the seed drill.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Let me understand this then. Prophesizing can be a one-time shot for any individual. It doesn't have to be a life's mission.
Correct.
So is that why we have 48? It's just somebody who said or did something in one?
No, there's a pretty, although it's certainly not complete, there's a pretty explicit tradition in Judaism about the manner of prophecy. There's a discipline involved in terms of character perfection and growth and personal and spiritual growth. And as Rabbi Schwab pointed out, he used the word guilds. I would have used the word schools, but it's a similar, I think we're talking the same idea. There was a notion that there were batei midrash, there were schools where someone who really aspired to this would go off and live in that community and study with the mentors, the sages of that community. And then, at least as the Rambam, as Maimonides, concludes that even if one has gone through all of these stages of learning and of growth and of spiritual practice, music, prayer, meditation, then God might or might not grant them prophecy. That was for these thousands of prophets that the Talmud talks about. Again, the prophets of the Bible are singled out because they have something to communicate which was not only for their own personal experience or even an experience that was relevant to their time in their immediate community, but they have something to say which would be relevant for all generations. I don't know if that helps clarify it or not.
And by the way, just to give a little historical context, the Rambam, known as Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon, lived about 1,000 years ago, roughly 900,000 years ago, in that range.
Okay.
So just to, as he's looking back, way post-biblical, a millennium post-biblical, he's looking back and looking at these schools where prophets might have been trained and looking at the fact that we don't have prophecy attributed to thousands of these prophets, but there were those who were trying to live that kind of spiritual life. And just to throw another little piece into it, Deuteronomy warns that a false prophet will in fact arise in the future, and they'll be able to work wonders, foretell the future. What makes them a false prophet is they will try to lead the people of Israel into other religious observances, worshiping a God you did not know. And by the way, that was a very serious offense and was a capital crime.
It might be relevant even just to kind of point out, because I think, again, this is kind of a misconception. I think outside the Jewish world, and especially outside the traditional Jewish world, people talk about prophets or prophecy, they automatically think the Bible. So it's important to point out that prophecy did not necessarily mean that a person is going to have a message or something to say to anybody else. Prophecy could be simply, to go back to your question you asked that we didn't really address, Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan offers a definition for prophecy, and it's partly helpful, I believe. He offers the definition that it's the highest experience of God that a mortal human being can still have, meaning while they're still alive in this world. So that doesn't mean you have to have a message. It doesn't mean you have to have something to communicate to anybody else. And so the idea of prophecy could be a very limited and private experience, or it could be a great public and even historical experience like the prophets of the Bible and everything in between.
So there is a section or a segment of the prophets that warranted their own books in the Bible.
Yes.
What distinguished them from all the others?
The fact that they had something to say that was not only immediately relevant in their time and in their community, but that what they had to say would have divine value, spiritual value for future generations as well. And that applicability to future generations, to the continuation of history, is what apparently made it important for them to be redacted in the Bible as opposed to other things.
So if I were to say that there are three functions that a prophet would serve as, a preacher, a predictor, and a watchman.
I would add a fourth.
Okay.
A messenger of hope.
Okay.
There's typically in the prophetic message what's called an nechemta, this message of hope at the end. God will be mad at you, but God's not going to desert you. There will be a redemption in the future. We're sitting here in exile, but I foresee a time when we'll be back in our own land. And if you look at the prophet Ezekiel, there's the truly remarkable vision of the valley of dry bones, and the interaction of can these bones live, and Ezekiel saying only you can know God, and God saying prophesy to them, and flesh comes on them, and it's, these bones are the house of Israel, and there's hope for the future. There will be continued life.
Well, and mentioning Yechezkel or Ezekiel actually brings in then another role of a prophet. And remember, so far we're only talking about the public prophets. Again, another role is a channel for divine influence or divine energy. The vision of the dry bones is taken as a very clear model or paradigm for the prophet is a person who is a channel for divine blessing, for divine energy into the world. What happens with the vision of the dry bones? You have a valley full of dry bones, which are described as the entire people of Israel, and then you have the bones being revived as fully formed people brought back to life, even with their souls reinstilled in them. This is all a notion of the prophet who, in that particular case, that particular model, is not only giving a message or an encouragement of some sort, but he's actually functioning as a tool or as a channel for divine influence, for divine flow to be able to make these things happen. That actually may even be part of the explanation of the word Navi, which is the Hebrew word for prophet, or one of the words actually. The key word we use is Navi, and it may come from the root boah, which means to bring something or to come, in which case the prophet indeed may be a channel of some kind.
And
Go ahead.
my favorite prophetic phrasing is, thus says the Lord God who spoke to me last night in a vision. And I'm saying it that way on purpose because this is dramatic literature. This is something that is supposed to change your perception. Go back to this vision here of Elijah. And it's a thing of it's a statement about don't look for God in some huge way, but look inside. Open your soul and your heart and your mind to God. Mm-hmm. It's the still small voice, and and when you talk about a watchman as a prophet, it's kind of keeper of the faith.
Yeah.
Keeping the people on track, because there could be other religions around, especially in their time, that might be more dramatic in terms of their ritual. Also, usually much more, in my view, inappropriate, but obviously having some attraction to people. And Elijah's giving us a warning. Stay away from that. That's not the real thing.
In terms of keeper of the faith, I think there's also a very insightful statement the sages make in the Talmud there. Our tradition says that ostensibly we could have done without the Bible, which means we would have done without all of these prophets written down. We would have done without this book that we have that now we open up and we say, oh, there's Isaiah and there's Ezekiel and there's Jonah and whoever. The sages say that if Israel had never sinned, all we would have in our hands today, and in their time, this is Talmudic times, but applies to us as well. If Israel had never sinned, all we would have in our hands is the 5 books of Moses and the book of Joshua. And all the rest of the Bible just wouldn't exist the way it does. I mean, we still would have had prophecy. We still would have had a tradition of things we've learned from all of these prophets, but we wouldn't have had this sort of formal framework. So clearly, this is saying that a major task of the prophets is to be the guides and the keepers of the faith and the people who get us back on track.
What qualified these 17 prophets over and above the rest of them? Is it a consistency, a track record? I mean, how does one, even today, judge legitimate from illegitimate prophecy?
You want to say something first?
Be my guest.
I think, first of all, keeping in mind that there's a continuum or levels of spiritual experience that we might somehow apply the word prophecy to, that in a classic sense, according to Jewish tradition, we don't have explicit prophecy now. Although we have something that may fit under the heading of prophetic experiences, which would be a lower and less articulate experience, such as a bat kol. But in
explain that term.
A divine voice. And we do have a tradition that great holy people throughout the generations can still experience some level of divine inspiration, but we don't refer to it as prophecy at that point. Prophecy ended, according to Jewish tradition, with the redaction of the Bible approximately. And in terms of, so what qualified these guys as being the guys who get and gals, because there's Dvorah HaNiviyah, for instance, there's Deborah the prophetess in the book of Judges. So these guys and gals, I should say, there's Dvorah, there's Huldah, there's a few women in there. Miriam was already mentioned. What qualifies these people is they pass the test of peer review. Seriously. Our tradition says that the redaction of the Bible, the creation of a canon, was done by the men of the Great Assembly with the return from the Babylonian exile, and these included the last of the prophets, meaning chronologically last, historically last of the prophets in the Bible. Haggai, Zechariah, Zechariah, Malachi, and also Mordechai from the book of Esther, several other figures from that time. So for them, it was a matter of peer review. They recognized who and what should be in the Bible, and they decided that.
Yeah. I think people lose sight of the fact that the Bible is a human assemblage, let's put it that way, with divine inspiration.
He knew I was going to jump in on that.
Yes, I did. I know my audience, at least part of it. And so it's like if you look at Christianity in the Nicene Creed, there was a vote, there was a committee, they took a vote. This is what Christianity is going to be. By the way, my understanding is they waited till some of the people were out of the room on a coffee break when they took the vote. I'm not making that up, by the way, who would be opposed to the direction that was taken. So if you go back to a time when there wasn't a printing press, you didn't pick up a Bible. You had individual scrolls. You had the scroll of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. You had the scroll of Isaiah, the scroll of Elijah, all of these separate scrolls that then there's a decision made about what's going to be included in, quote, the canon, literally the measuring stick, and what's not. So when we look at this and who's included and who's not, peer review is a very good way to put it. This is what stood the test of time and comes to be called Tanakh. The Torah, meaning 5 books of Moses, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the additional writings that are part of the Bible. And the other piece of the prophets, by the way, to go back to something else, is, I think, a spiritual lighthouse, if you will. There's something that calls the people back to spirituality. When sacrifices become simply rote, mechanical, devoid of real meaning, it's the prophets who call us back and who want us to get a spiritual meaning, a connection to God from what we're doing, not to take this as just ordinary. And I think that's a place for the prophets as well. Keeper of the religion, a channel, etc. And you don't have people nowadays within Judaism standing up and saying, God appeared to me in a vision last night, and thus says the Lord God.
Well, question. I mean, the little bit of studying I've done on the prophets, it seems like they basically ended around the time of the destruction of the Second Temple.
No, around the time of the building of the Second Temple. That's 400 years earlier. The canon, as far as we're concerned, as far as our tradition is concerned, the canon was already established and closed at the time of the return from the Babylonian exile, the return from Persia at that point, with the building of the Second Temple.
Now,
so that's an earlier period. The destruction of the Second Temple is the destruction by the Romans around 70 of the Common Era.
Right, but I thought that Rabbi Akiva is involved in some of this canonization in terms of he's the one, I thought, who puts his word in and gets an imagery of Solomon's Song of Songs to be included, because it's not just a human love poem, but a poem of love between God and the people of Israel. And I thought that was attributed to Akiva, who's of that time.
Well, it's true that the Mishnah records a dispute between the sages and Rabbi Akiva if, for instance, the Song of Songs was just erotic or if it belonged in the Bible. But as I understand it, that was really an academic debate that was already occurring after the fact. That's my understanding. I may be wrong about that, but our tradition, pretty strictly speaking, the Talmud in Bava Batra talks pretty clearly about who's responsible, I won't say just for the writing, but for the publication of each of the books of the Bible. And the general summary there, the general agreement there is that the men of the Great Assembly as a group then decided what the canon was going to be, because they realized that the age of great prophecy was coming to an end, at least until sometime in the future. And so they would be the last people who would really have this ability to determine what really belonged and what didn't. Yeah.
And it also gets them off the hook for the book of Maccabees.
Well,
which isn't included in the Jewish canon.
That's
I'm
right.
trying to find in my notes where I saw that, because that was the impression I was left with, but I can't read them now while I'm trying to do the show. But okay, so
we can follow up on that.
And this is one where I agree, because I believe that prophecy gets closed off way before the Second Temple. You don't have prophecy going on. And whether or not this is divine or human, forgive me for that one, it becomes an essential element. Because, again, one of the functions of a prophet, or one of the ways they did function, let's put it that way, was to stand up in the midst of everything and say, wait a second, you're doing it wrong. This isn't what God wants. Therefore, you have the comment about, when did I ever ask you for sacrifices? Your declaration of new moons is an abomination to me.
Yeah.
So, if you're going to have a religion function and continue, you can't have the anarchy that comes with prophets and with the potential for false prophets as well. Now you have to look inward to a deeper kind of divine inspiration, which is what you were talking about as what we would call a prophetic experience, but on a very personal level, that guides us, and again, still with peer review, with just because one rabbi says it, it has to be, doesn't mean it's absolute law. You have to have people that accept it along the way.
On the historical note, by the way, just to kind of even sort of emphasize this point of when the period of great or explicit or public prophecy ended, at least for now, the prophecy is related, according to our tradition, to the land of Israel and therefore also to the Beit HaMikdash, to the temple in Jerusalem. And the second temple, our tradition records, was lacking important elements that the first temple had, not only artifacts like the ark, but also the miracles that occurred in the first temple were not occurring in the second temple. And that idea of the public miracles occurring in the temple is also related in a way to this idea of great public prophecy. So all of this was a radical historical transition with the return from the exile. The building of the second temple really began a new era. An era without great explicit prophecy, even though prophetic experience continued.
Yet, wouldn't that have been the period when it was most needed?
Could be, but I can't argue with the circumstances.
The religion, I think any religion, is not static. And the exile experience and the return bring us to a different place and different needs. There's a huge paradigm shift that goes on with the destruction of the first temple. In the ancient world, when two armies fought, it wasn't just the armies, it was their gods. And if you had the bigger god, my god's bigger than your god, then you won.
Yeah.
And
something's bigger than Phil.
Right. And nobody wants to worship a loser. So the extraordinary shift that happens is that the Jews come to the conclusion they had understood there was really only one God, and that if this happened, it wasn't that the Babylonian god or gods were stronger than ours, but that this was God's will. So now we come back from the exile, and this rebuilding then becomes a human endeavor, because the destruction of the first temple comes from, theoretically, correct me if there's another view, our disloyalty to God. The destruction of the second temple comes about because of the way people treated each other.
Well, that was still taken as a disloyalty to God.
That's true. Because
that is a message that, again, that I saw pretty regularly in these 17 prophets.
Right.
You're not doing God's will.
Mm-hmm.
God is going to punish you, and then some of them later on, and then after you're punished enough, God will re-embrace you.
The image, okay, I think, is much like a parent. When a parent punishes a child, it's not because they hate the child. They're upset with the child's behavior. But the underlying love is still there. And that's also a message of the prophet. It's not just at some point in the future God will take you back or you'll be able to come back to the land, but this idea that this is a symbol of God's continuing love. and therefore continuing relationship with us. And that becomes an essential element of the prophets as well.
Would it be fair to say that the prophets put a greater emphasis on the concept of compassion? I mean, compassion was in the first 5 books, and to me, again, it sounds like they really brought it to the forefront. That their message was, a lot of the times, what you are doing to others is not okay.
I think that's a legitimate statement, but I think it's a little off focus.
Okay.
I think that if there's an objection that's common in many of the prophets, that much of that objection is the objection to what is at one point called in the Bible mitzvat anashim melumada, carrying out religious acts as acts of rote. In other words, having reduced the religion of the Torah, which is supposed to be a deep and longing and aspiring worship of God, which includes interhuman relations, and the quality of those relations, but having reduced all of that to nothing but going through the motions. I have a friend here in town, one of my best friends at work actually, who is a dyed-in-the-wool Baptist. Her husband, he should rest in peace, was a minister here in town, and she has this classic objection, of course, to Judaism as being too legalistic, but in a sense, that objection is part of the objection of the prophets. We're supposed to keep all the commandments that are listed in the Torah. We're supposed to keep all of them according to their laws and their details. But if we reduce our religious life, our worship of God, to only going through those motions, checking off the checklist each day, did I do this, did I do that, and having removed the deep, longing, spiritual, aspiring element, and having removed how, talking about prophecy as a channel and religion as a channel, having removed how all of this religious life is supposed to infuse daily human life with a divine quality, that was the major common objection of the prophets.
Which would then put that in the context, again, for me, of compassion.
Okay, well, that's why I say I think that was correct.
I'm not here to
I just
serve
would have
God
rephrased it
directly.
a little.
I'm here to serve God by serving God's children.
Well, I would say even both.
Yes, you do both, and it's a question then of perhaps maybe did you use the word emphasis? The prophet,
re-emphasize actually.
Right. It's not that the prophets are the messengers of compassion, because that's already built into the foundations of the religion. What they're doing is calling people back, if you will, to the higher calling that's required by the religion, which is don't just go through this mechanically, but there's a spiritual aspect to this, and if you divorce yourself from that, then you get to the point where the 3 groups that are often mentioned are the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. What they have in common is they're the disenfranchised of that ancient society. They have no one to speak up for them. It's sort of like the illegal immigrant who's trying to live here peacefully and make a living here in Santa Fe. They're afraid to go to authorities. They're afraid when they've been abused to speak out because they're on such thin ice. The widow, the orphan, and the stranger, as disenfranchised people in that society, are most at risk. And it's very easy to slip into, well, so if I take this from them, who's going to complain? Who's going to argue? So the prophets come up as defenders of this idea of compassion, if you will. Don't do that. Keep in mind that these are human beings. Keep in mind that what God wants from us is not only to serve God, but to serve God by loving others. How do you love God? You love your neighbor as yourself, meaning you want for your neighbor those things that you would want for yourself. You celebrate the accomplishments of your neighbor.
I think there's another major theme, even 2 really, 2 other major themes that I think we really need to at least point out. One of them, you opened up with Eliyahu, with Elijah the prophet. Well, what was the major struggle that he was contending with? His major message and his major struggle, for instance, was not on the interhuman relations issue and the compassion issue, which is not to negate it. It's just saying that wasn't his particular struggle. His major struggle was with syncretism, with a confused worship, where people were worshiping both God and idols. They were worshiping in the manner that we were commanded at Sinai when the Torah was given through Moses, and they were taking on other things and mixing it and creating it. And of course, the classic illustration of that is Eliyahu's confrontation with the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel, where the city of Haifa is today, right? So certainly one of the major issues that comes up in the prophets, not only by Elijah, but I think he's a great example, is the notion of our spiritual focus in terms of worship and aspiration has to be solely on God without being tainted by other factors, by other deities, by whatever that may be.
And as much as he speaks about the still small voice, that confrontation on Mount Carmel results in Elijah killing 300 of the priests of Baal for trying to lead the people of Israel astray. So when we talk about compassion mixed with defender of the faith, I'm not suggesting that in today's world we go out and kill people. That's not at all what I'm saying. Don't take it that way. But in that day and age, there was that kind of thing. There was that dramatic a battle going on for the hearts and the souls and the lives of the people.
And then the other focus, which we haven't even mentioned at all, really is, and I think this has to do with reading the Tanakh, in a sense, reading it with a tradition such as we have, because all these prophets we're talking about were Jews. They were part of the Jewish people. But there's also a universalistic character to these prophets. So that even though many of the things being very specifically stated by the prophets are specific to Judaism, specific to the land of Israel, specific to the temple, nonetheless, much of what they're saying is also about a vision which is a vision of hope and a vision of godliness for all of humanity. Because ultimately Judaism is interested in godliness for all of humanity, even though we work through the medium or the vehicle of a particular religion. And of course, one of the interesting examples of that, I think, is when I was a young man growing up on the East Coast. So this was a period of time when there was a great deal of struggle for Soviet Jewry. Soviet Jews at the time were held behind the Iron Curtain, not allowed to go to Israel or to other places. And we used to go to the streets of New York and demonstrate. And of course, the place we demonstrated most was Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza in front of the United Nations. And what's written on that wall there at the plaza in front of the United Nations is part of Isaiah's vision, right? Beating swords into plowshares, creating a human community where all of humanity turns to God. Isaiah's vision culminates in Mala ha'aretz Dea et Hashem kemayim liyam nichasim, that the whole earth will be filled with an awareness, an experience of God like the oceans are filled with water. He doesn't say the Jews, he doesn't say Israel, he says the whole earth, all of humanity. So that's an element which, even though it's sometimes not as easy to emphasize if you're sticking strictly to the text, it is clearly there and it is clearly part of the whole biblical vision.
My house will be a house of worship for all
Yes.
people.
Yes.
Not just Jews, all
Right.
people.
Yeah, and also in Isaiah, he talks about the coming of basically what is then called the Messiah, coming from the house of David, creating a lineage monarchy that's exclusive.
Now that, of course, is not new to Isaiah, because it already began with Samuel and the anointment of David. Right? This has already begun, and the idea of a future Messiah. I'm emphasizing the word future because in Hebrew, Mashiach or Messiah very simply and very plainly means someone who's been anointed. It's not necessarily, well, no, not only a king, because we have at least three roles. We see the verb used for anointing the vessels of the tabernacle at its inauguration. We see the Kohen Meshuach Milchama. We see the priest who is to provide spiritual leadership in time of war and crisis is anointed. So it's not even only the king who's anointed. But so this vision of a future Messiah is the vision of a reestablishment and a renewal of a Davidic kingship. So
How
that
future is the future?
whenever God determines.
Okay, well, I mean, there is a certain amount of prediction in the prophets. Some major, some minor apocalyptic stuff. Are they because I mean, part of the book of Revelation, part of Christianity, takes a lot of these prophets, takes a lot of their predictions, and I'm asking, are they taken out of context? I mean, are we talking about, if you don't do this, God's going to do this, but it's going to happen in the next 2 years, or I mean, are we saying this is an ongoing pattern, or both, or neither?
Go ahead.
I believe that the messianic fervor that comes into Judaism is, first of all, I think there's a prophetic vision of what the perfect future can be like. But ultimately, I think the rabbis, and I suspect you may differ with me on this one, use it as a tool. When the temple gets destroyed in the year 70, the rabbis take this as an opportunity to do away with the sacrificial cult. And sacrifices could have been offered elsewhere, theoretically, because the Torah itself says, in that place where I cause my name to dwell. It used to be Shiloh. There was a time when it was in the tribe of Dan.
Okay, but
right?
but
it gets coalesced to Jerusalem.
And once it becomes coalesced to Jerusalem, it's then bamot chutz, then sacrificing anywhere else is then forbidden. Right. And so if it's going to be reestablished, it has to be reestablished.
So people say to the rabbis, "Oy, we've lost the temple. When will we get it back again? My kind, my child, don't worry. It'll happen. We're not going to do it, but it will be miraculously rebuilt when the Messiah comes. Rabbi, when will that be? Don't worry about it, kid. It's a long ways away." And in fact,
I do disagree with this presentation.
Of course. And this is how important or unimportant the Messiah may be. If you're planting a tree and someone comes to you and says, "Mashiach is here, the Messiah has come," finish planting the tree first. Then you can go greet the Messiah. There's a very worldly aspect to this and a very practical aspect to this whole piece. And should we look to a vision of the future that would be better? Yes, we should. We shouldn't lose that hope. But one of the divisions between traditional Judaism, which Mordechai represents, and Reform Judaism, liberal Judaism, which I represent, is that within Reform, there came to be the notion that we are not looking for a personal Messiah, meaning somebody, a person who's anointed to be king of the Jews again. We're looking towards a messianic age, a time that is where the world is perfected, and it's up to us to work to make that happen. So for me, whether or not there's a personal Messiah or not is unimportant. For me personally, and for Reformed Judaism as a movement, if we do the work that the prophets lay out for us and the Torah lays out for us and perfect the world, make it what we feel it should be in terms of kindness and compassion and all of those things, once the world is perfected, listen, if there's a Messiah who's going to be king and rule over us, mazel tov. And if not, what do I care? The world has been perfected. We've done the work of redeeming the world that is the important part, I think, of the task.
And as Rabbi Schwab already kind of indicated, from a traditional perspective, what the prophets were talking about isn't mere metaphor. There is metaphor in the Bible, but it's not reduced to metaphor only. And in fact, the idea that there will be a reestablishment of a Davidic dynasty and a re-expression of that kingship as part of and as facilitating a greater renewal for Israel and for mankind is a very real notion. and there really will be an anointed king again, and with a rebuilding of the temple and with a reestablishment of worship in the temple in Jerusalem, as well as all of the other things. I mean, certainly I agree with the aspiration for a great messianic age, but again, the Bible is not mere metaphor. Just like the places mentioned in the Bible are real places. When I teach biblical text, when I taught it as a teacher in school, and when I teach it now in the Beit Midrash, we're learning right now the book of Joshua on Monday nights, I use maps. And I use maps not only because people ought to be able to see where things were out of curiosity, but to help bring home the point that what we're reading in the Tanakh, in the biblical text, is real people, real places, and when we talk about predictions for the future, such as the renewal of a Davidic kingship, we're talking about a prediction of real events. Now, it could be, admittedly, that because we're talking about a prediction for the future, and because the prophet is trying to translate into words, into human language, a prophetic experience which was supracognitive, which was beyond normal rational communication, so it could be that we need to interpret and understand things that are not in the simple reading of the words, like a literal translation. But nonetheless, we can't reduce the Bible only to metaphor and only to grand vision.
And there is this piece that's very important, since you're going to have two Christian clergy on in the next show. There is in mainstream Judaism the obligation that we have to work to perfect the world and make the world a suitable place for the Messiah to come, meaning it's got to be good enough and proper enough for that event to happen, is contrasted to those elements within Christianity that say, listen, don't worry about anything, because when the world gets bad enough, God will send the Messiah who will fix everything. And those are two very, very different approaches. Now, I'm not saying that either of the two men you're having on next week are going to take that approach, but that certainly was one approach for fundamentalist Christians who felt that they didn't have to worry about ecology, global warming, anything else, because, listen, if we screw it up badly enough, God will step in and fix it. And for us, it's our obligation. And I go back to the Torah, not exactly prophetic necessarily, where it says, often translated as the sins of the parents will be visited upon the children, the actions of the parents, whatever actions you have consequences for the coming generation. If you are a pregnant woman and you drink alcohol, your child is going to have fetal alcohol syndrome, or may. And therefore, the things that you've done, not necessarily a sin, but the actions you've taken, are going to have a consequence for the future. As we use nuclear energy, the waste that we leave behind, which is going to be radioactive for 20,000 years or more, is going to have consequences for the generations that follow us. And so, for me, there's the foundational piece in the Torah, and then you have the prophets who are telling us, come back to doing things the right way. And part of it is, what are the consequences going to be if you don't for the next generation? What's going to happen to your children, your children's children? There is that underlying piece again of hope that if you do things right, God still loves you, God will bring you back to what you should be, becomes a very important piece.
I would point out that Yeshayahu has a very subtle but important phrase. Ani Hashem be'eta achishena. I'm God, I will make this happen in its time, I will hasten it. So our sages ask, what does Isaiah mean by this? If something's going to occur in its time, you're not hastening it. And if you're hastening it, it's not occurring in its set time. And so the sages explained, our tradition says, Zechu achishena, lo zechu be'eta, that if we merit it, if we do, as Rabbi Schwab was saying, if we do our job like we're supposed to, improving the world, setting the foundations for the ultimate redemption, then that ultimate redemption will occur more quickly, sooner, and also with less travail. Because every birth involves birth pangs. But even if we do not merit the ultimate redemption, meaning we didn't do our jobs like we're supposed to, there is an ultimate hope that it's God's world and it's God's universe, and therefore, even if we didn't deserve it, at some point the ultimate redemption has to occur, and it occurs because we're following God's agenda in the end, not a human run agenda. But we'd rather see, and this is what all the prophets are urging us, we'd rather see that we emulate God ourselves by fixing the world, by advancing a civil and a godly society, so that that ultimate redemption occurs without travail and occurs sooner. But even, as I say, even if, God forbid, we don't fulfill our obligations, even if we don't stand up to what we're supposed to, what God expects and requires of us, that ultimate redemption will come about. But it will come about later, and we'll be paying the price along the way for its occurring.
We're starting to run down on time. Either one of you want to make an announcement?
Just...
We're friends.
The announcement? Yes. All of everything we've been saying is that what God wants of us is to create a civil and a godly society among all of mankind, and that is what we have to be striving for and working for. And we always have to, therefore, judge our actions and the state of our community by the standards of, does this advance godliness, or does this create in some way a hiding or a veil for godliness in the world?
Both Kol Barama and Temple Beth Shalom are very active in the realm of education. And so there are, both of us bring scholars in to enhance the spirituality and the awareness of our congregations. On February 10th, we're bringing in Rabbi Larry Bach from El Paso, Texas.
We have scholars over at the same time then.
Yes,
we have Dr. Matt Goldish over that same weekend. I didn't realize.
So, and so there are a variety of things going on in both places, and I suggest people look at our websites or call our phone numbers to see what's going on, because it doesn't just end there. And there are lots of things going on by way of this. Also, Temple Beth Shalom is now at the point of streaming our Friday night services live to the internet on ustream.tv. And you can go there and then search for Rabbi Marv, one word, and come to the podcast or the streaming and see it ultimately commercial free. At the moment, there are some ads you may have to click through that have nothing to do with the synagogue.
Of course, people are welcome to contact us, either of us, but people are welcome to contact us if they want to discuss more about this or learn more.
I got one more question I want to throw out to two of you. Let's
Sure.
get another announcement.
Just one thing that I think it's important for people to see, and that is that here you have the somewhat radical reformer sitting with the traditionalist. We are friends, and we support each other, and we learn from each other, and we guide each other in this endeavor of trying to understand the prophetic legacy.
Okay.
That's a good line.
I thought
like
that was pretty
That was very good.
It's okay.
Very nice.
Now your question, Phil.
To end this, we got about 4 minutes left. In the sense of the prophets, prophetic, whatever, would Jesus be considered a prophet?
From a traditional perspective, plain and simply, no.
No.
Okay.
From a reform perspective,
No.
No.
Okay.
Why?
First of all, he's in the wrong time. There's that. Second of all,
I mean, is it only time? Would there not be a message that was carrying that fits into that?
A person can have a great public message and not be a prophet. A person can simply be an intelligent spiritual person and have a great public message. But to be blunt and indelicate, I don't think we can ignore the fact that traditionally the Jews did not accept Jesus as somebody that they wanted to learn from or follow.
nor did they accept Muhammad, who presented himself as a prophet to the Jews before he went off to create his own religion. So there are a variety of things. One of the things that I think, Phil, I feel constrained to say is, It's very difficult for us in today's world to look back at the image, the character of Jesus, and have any real idea of what Jesus himself may or may not have said because of the shaping of traditions. And there are many things that I look at and I say, oh, well, Jesus was purported to have said X. You know, in reality, that's straight mainline Jewish teaching. The great comment about render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Dine de malchuta dine. The laws of the land are the laws, and both mean pay your taxes because the government knows where you are. And yes, you have to pay your taxes even if there's an image of the king on the coin. The other aspect, you know, I once asked where it was the Catholic Church got its authority for confession and absolution. And the comment was, well, Jesus said to Peter, that which is forgiven on earth will be forgiven in heaven. And from that, the Catholic Church went off and came up with confession. And internally, I went, oy vey. Because what Jesus was saying was exactly what we say every Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. That for forgiveness to come, first you make it right with your fellow human being. You must go and get forgiveness from the person that you've wronged. And then, after you've been forgiven here, then you can look for divine forgiveness. What's forgiven on earth will be forgiven in heaven. They went in a very different direction. They can do that in their religion, but when you do that in quote, the name of Jesus, that takes him out of the boundaries, if you will, of Judaism. And there has been such enmity over the ages between church and synagogue that it's not possible to look at these things without some of this backdrop and some of this history. And what's been done in Jesus' name puts him in a place that it's just not, it's not for us. And we don't see Jesus as a prophet. There are those Jews who may see Jesus as having some wonderful things to say, and those people who say to me they're followers of Jesus puts them on a path that I think can be a very good path through life. But within the Jewish context, Jesus doesn't really have a place. Is that an accurate statement?
I'll let it go with that.
Okay.
Good. I'm glad you did because we are almost out of time.
Sorry.
Both of you, I thank you so much for being here.
It was a privilege. Thank you.
For all that you've added to the show.
It was really a privilege.
Thank you.
A pleasure.
I want to thank you all for watching. I hope that you've learned something from this and hope you've got a bunch of questions you want to ask, because hopefully I'm going to ask them for you next week. So next week we're going to look at the prophets again from a Christian perspective. Again, I'm going to have Brother Brian Dabowski and Reverend Father Richard Murphy, Reverend Dr. Richard Murphy. And we're going to look at this from the opposite side, so to speak, and see what we've gotten, what's been taken from it, and how it's been utilized, and how it's been referred back to. So thank you all for tuning in. Listen to that still small voice. That's why I chose that. That has a resonation with me. I'm Reverend Phil, and I've been your host for Words of the Prophets. Thank you for tuning in. Please join me again next week, same time, same channel, for more Words of the Prophets.